I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I record this podcast. I am on Yagarbal country, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today. Hi, Smart Community friends. Welcome back to this very special series here on the Smart Community Podcast, all about data storytelling. As part of my PhD research, I have been speaking with experts from all over the world who are using data visualizations and storytelling in real-world projects to support decision-making and advocacy. In today's episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I am speaking with Rocio Rodriguez Almaraz. We actually met on a Homeward Bound leadership program, and we spent some time in Antarctica together. Rocio is a campaign strategist, documentary producer, and project manager focused on climate change campaigns and projects and based in Argentina. Rocio and I discussed the role and importance of data visualization and storytelling in advocacy, strategies to use data to engage audiences and create impact, as well as the challenges faced by NGOs or non-government organizations and small organizations in communicating effectively due to limited resources. We talk about the need to tailor communication and data visualization to different audiences and contexts. Rocio shares some examples of impactful data visualizations and their influences on decision-making and public awareness, and reflects on the complexities of measuring impact and attributing change to specific communication efforts. We finish our chat with Rocio's advice about using data visualization to prioritize what is most important to communicate. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the Smart Community, Smart Regions, Smart Towns, and Smart Cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Rocio. How are you today?
I'm great and happy to be here.
Amazing. Thanks so much for coming on to the Smart Community Podcast, this very special series for my PhD around data visualization and storytelling. I am really excited to have this conversation with you. So let's just jump straight in. And can you tell us about yourself, your background, and a little bit about some of the projects or some of the work that you are currently doing?
Yes. So my name is Rocio Rodriguez Almaraz. My background is advertising. I worked for NGOs in the last 7 years. Previous to that, I worked in digital agencies as project manager. And I also worked for clients that were NGOs as well, such as UNICEF, Engineers Without Borders, Argentina, and others. And I also am being a volunteer for many causes. And in the last few projects, I worked in the production of a couple of documentaries, mostly focused on climate. I'm currently a producer for a local project called Las Loicas, which is about a town that's going to be drought due to the building of the dam. The town might disappear. And stories about that. Before that, I worked as an associate producer for a feature documentary called The Welcome Table by Josh Fox, the director of Gasland. And I also produced, co-directed, and I was a scriptwriter for a documentary about the impacts and the consequences of the fracking extraction, the fracking technique in Patagonia. And apart from that, I also worked in communication for NGOs and in advocacy as well.
Yeah, wow. So much there. And I know you're starting a new project soon, which is really exciting. I think let's go, you're starting the documentary, but overall, what would you say the different organizations that you work with, what are some of the common ways that you've used data visualizations and storytelling in your work?
Well, I think that data visualization is useful to create certain impact regarding specific data, also to summarize many kinds of information that if you see them, you'll understand them better. And I think that also when the way that you show that data, because you can create like a graph that will tell you something, but if that graph is also telling you something about the subject that you're talking to about, I think that adds another layer of storytelling, and it's interesting. So because you are telling more, and perhaps even you are in a way playing with and creating some sort of a mystery around the subject and you want to learn more. So I think data visualization, it's a very good entry point to someone who might want to learn more about the subject, but we have to be creative in terms of how we can create that experience of that sort of mystery in communication.
Yeah, that's interesting way to put it, to that mystery. Is that kind of trying to like invoke somebody's curiosity, right?
Yes, I think the problem that we have right now is that we are always receiving lots of stimuli and we are competing with, our attention is competing with everything. Everything is shiny, colorful. Everyone is doing something that it's amazing, but then we have very limited time and we need to be mindful about where we put our focus. And we are also competing with the things that are also even addictive, you know, like, I don't know, TikTok reels about dogs, anything. So I think we need to understand how those things work, but we have to be smart in how we use them, and we have to be wise about how we use them, because I come from an environment where we want to create change with what we are showing. But I think that another layer of that message is how we are creating that change. And if I'm creating something that gives you anxiety, for example, that for me is not a coherent message and with what we are aiming to do. So it's not only what we're showing, it's about how we're showing it. And I'm not talking only about how the graphics look, but what's the whole strategy? What kind of feelings are we trying to suggest in a way in that interaction?
So it's not just about what we do, but how we do it and what emotions we're trying to evoke in people and things like that. So you've been working a lot in the NGO space, so non-government organizations, which I imagine most of the time is around advocacy and change. So what types of issues and problems are you trying to address or influence using data and storytelling?
I think there's a wide range of uses, and because everything communicates. So whether you are doing a documentary that has any kind of data visualization, or you are creating a presentation for a government officer to show them some sort of project that you want them to be engaged with, you can use data in many ways. Like, for example, and this is not necessarily linked specifically to data visualization, but to design as well. For example, if you're a small NGO and you are showing to a possible funder or someone from a government proposal that you have, the fact that you are using a good design, a thoughtful design, it will make an impact. Apart from that, if the data that you're using to support whatever you're proposing, it's shown in an impactful way, it will create an impact. Just because it looks professional, looks like you, even though you may be a small organization, you have what it takes to get the best out of what you're doing. And it's shown in a small presentation. I think that says a lot about everything that we do. And I see it as now with AI, it's easier, but I think it has been a problem. The fact that there are many, many interesting organizations that do things that are very impactful, but they may not have the resources to communicate what they do in the best way, in the most impactful way. But in a way, that also happens because they may use their resources for the things that really matter, and not maybe they don't understand or they don't have the resources to use communication in a more strategic way to get further funding or opportunities to create a greater impact in what they are already doing very well. So yes, I don't know if I'm answering your questions or if you want me to dig more into something specific.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess even if we have the data, if we don't show it in a way that the audience or the, whoever it is, decision maker, or, maybe it's the community, or we don't communicate that in a way that they can understand it quite quickly and easily, like you were talking about earlier, when our attention is, pulled in so many different directions, but we still need to make these decisions, that's a really key part of creating impact. But a small organization may not prioritize that as a resource because they don't know, or they don't know how much of an impact, or they don't realize how much of an impact having good communication, including data and visualization, can have. Is that right?
Yes, but not necessarily because they don't know the impact, but rather specifically in this context, the resources are very limited. So if you have some resources to, support a refugee program or in communication, what would you do?
Sure.
But having professionals that are specialized in that can actually lead you to getting further funding to support whatever you're doing in a greater way.
So I guess this next question is about audience and different people involved. In some of the projects you've done, let's talk about some of the audiences that you've had to think about, or stakeholders. And so how do you consider your audience when you're creating a data visualization or a story or a piece of communication? What's some of the things you need to consider when you're creating the data visualizations and stories for, in particular, audiences?
I think that one of the things that are important for me is trying to understand what it's important for that audience in general, and how can I bring that to whatever I'm showing. But also, I think it's important to understand first, which I think is a problem for many people working with data visualization. It's what is the key element or the key data that I need to show when selling a bigger story. Because sometimes there's a lot of people, I guess, working in like showing data, but okay, why should I care about this? Why is this important? I think the why, it's important because you can link it to a specific audience. What is important for those people, and why am I picking this specific part of this information to show it to you? I think it's important to understand that since attention is limited, we need to understand how to make a selection of what's important, and to not to get people be too overwhelmed. And because I think it's more important to repeat an idea several times to reinforce it, rather than adding too much information that can put you out of focus on whatever I'm trying to just convince you to do in a way. If you need to, donate here, for example, or act now signing this petition. So I need to be smart on what I'm showing to you and what I'm asking you to do. I think it's the relationship with the audience. It has to be grounded in the fact that it's important for them. Like, for example, when I was working in the documentary about Vaca Muerta, we had a challenge, which was that the documentary would be focused on two different audiences, an international one and a local one. One of them was an international one, mostly living in Europe, in countries where many companies that are investing in Vaca Muerta come from. So there were some elements that we were showing that were targeted to them, And there were another set of elements and data that we need to show that were more focused on the local audiences. So everything related to how it was funded was mostly done in a way that someone from abroad would understand it very well. But then there were other elements. There were some nuances about the local politics that would create a different reaction to the local people living here. Like, for example, if in that case, we showed several movie clips with what the presidents were telling about these Vaca Muerta projects during their presidency. And they were all saying the same thing. Even though they come from different parties, right wing, left wing, everything, they were doing the same thing. And that's something that we need to show. And what I'm trying to say is that for the local people, certain images or certain data will create a more emotional reaction because it's something that it's very close to where we are. So we had different goals in different segments of the film that were focused to different audiences. So we have to create different strategies for them and test them, of course.
Yeah. So it's like if we talk about the medium of a documentary, there'll be different elements or different areas within that whole piece that will be targeted for different audience. So how do you get to know your audience?
That's a very hard question to answer.
I thought so.
Yeah. I think it depends on how are you going to engage with them or what kind of audience are you talking about? Because again, with digital, it's easier, but it also has its challenges. With the governments, it depends on how you're going to contact them or to engage with them. Also, I think that sometimes you may be in a context where there will be audiences that you haven't planned that there were going to be an audience. And you need to understand that can happen and that how you can learn more about them. Like, for example, I do a documentary about, I don't know, Vaca Muerta, but then there's a lot of organizations focused on human rights that may be interested in the documentary and you didn't know about that. Of course, initially you have to understand that you need to sort of map who could be the potential audiences that you may have, but sometimes you realize that there might be people that are interested in whatever you're doing, and I think also it's in a way something that grows with time because your audience also can change with time. But yeah, I think that's a very, very hard question to answer because it depends a lot on whatever you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And it is tough because I think you could think you know some of your audience or this is what my audience cares about. And like you said, there's digital tools that can help us around behaviors and what people are doing online. But in the real world, they might be doing different things, or it might be you're trying to engage with an audience. So, for example, a local community, like you were talking about earlier, do you, like, to find out what they care about, do you go into the community and talk to them? Like, sometimes that's not possible, obviously, but like understanding what they care about at a personal level, maybe, yeah, I don't know. Is that something that we need to focus on? I guess it depends how much resource you've got as well, right? Like,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but every time you have the opportunity to engage with some people that are in a way representative of the audience that you are aiming to contact with, I think that that's a lot of very valuable information. And I think that sometimes that's also a problem, trying to create, like, for example, campaign that is targeted to people that you haven't spoken before. And sometimes that can lead to problems that you didn't think that could happen, but they happen. Is you you don't spend enough time trying to understand how that audience may look like.
Yeah, and I guess it depends. If it's a campaign, for example, you're continuing to learn. Like, it's not just here's the message, here's the data, here's the story, and then, high five, you're out of there. It's like you continue to learn what that audience cares about, and it will, like you said earlier, it can change as well. Do you need to adapt your messaging then, I guess, to then meet that audience too?
Yes, and I think it's not that it can change, it will change. Because, like, for example, in case of social media, the algorithm changes, So what you have done 2 months before, it may not be useful now. If you haven't been that active with your account, you won't have the same impact as if you were active, like in moments where you were more active. It also, if you have seen something for the very first time, it will create an impact. But if you have seen it the same, in a way, the same structure, if you have used those same ways to produce whatever you're doing, it will also create a lesser impact, and it won't be as effective as it was. I think in every communication effort that we do, we have to be creative, especially now that there's so much competition. And I think that, like, for example, this is not necessarily linked to data visualization, but it's also something to keep in mind. Like, for example, if I'm doing an impact campaign for a documentary, people tend to think, we can put a QR code and show a presentation and whatever, and they can see it. But perhaps it's more useful if you have someone on the entrance just gathering data of the people attending, and you have a list of the participants, and you ask them if they want to be engaged or not. Because especially if you have to make things easier for whatever goals you have. So you have to understand if you want those people to be engaged after whatever you're doing. You have to be mindful of what's the best way to approach them. If you're asking, like, for example, I've gone to the TED Talks, and sometimes, if you have like 10,000 attendees and you have QR code there, or you have a link right after a presentation, that will have an impact, of course. But sometimes we're talking about things that are working on a minor scale, and perhaps you put, like many resources in creating an event for 50 people. You have to have a conversation, at least half of them. So because you have to be mindful of how you use it, and when you're presenting your data, you have to create that. You want them to be really engaged, because that's an effort focused on 50 people. It's not something that you do and then you forget, because then it's not that strategic.
Yeah, the scale is important to think about, right? And your relationship with the audience and how you engage with them will be different depending on what scale you're at. And the audience will have different expectations. If they're, a focus group, there's only 10 people in the room, maybe they don't want to, go into engage with them through a QR code, because they're going to go, "Hey, I'm right here. Why don't you just ask me?" Perhaps. Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to talk about some of the projects you've worked on. So, like, impactful, I guess, data visualizations and stories. So either ones that you've worked on yourself, or ones that have left an impression on you, particularly around, decision making, and if it's changed the way that you, not necessarily you, but audience have thought about certain things, or you've seen that impact.
Yes. Well, I can tell you a couple of examples. Until very recently, I was working as a project coordinator for an organization called Live in the Grand Initiative. And a colleague of mine had mapped the fossil fuel projects and the fossil fuel deposits within protected areas. And with that information, they had to create presentations to show them to government officials about what's the possibility of including the potential emissions of those plant projects within their NDCs. And
what's an NDC?
NDC, it's the way that the Paris Agreement. So each government has to create a commitment about how they reduce their emissions.
Okay.
And that it's done through NDC, which I don't know the acronym in English.
Oh, yeah, in English.
Sorry. So, for example, the government of Colombia is saying that it will reduce by 2030, 67% of their emissions in oil, for example. That is an NDC. So every couple of years, each country has to update those commitments to be more ambitious.
I looked up nationally determined contributions.
Yes.
Yeah, mechanism for climate action. Okay, perfect. Sorry. I didn't know what that was, and I didn't think the audience would know either. Cool. Okay, back to you.
Okay, so the fact that we have mapped those projects and we were able to see where there was a UNESCO map reserve, and that there were coal plants there, or coal deposits, and that made a lot easier for us to understand which projects or areas were the most interesting in terms of, for example, there's a coal mine that it's in a stage where it hasn't been licensed yet. So there's an opportunity. So because it's easier to stop it in a way, you have only to remove that from the public offering. And so we try to choose the more appealing cases in each country and created presentations for those and try to show them in a way that, you show them in a map, you list them, then you can say, this is what they say. And you put lots of images of these protected areas that are going to be affected, or you tell a story about, okay, there's a parrot there that's going to affect it, and that parrot, it's important because blah, blah, blah. No, you choose whatever can create a good selling point and a conversation. Or another thing that we had linked with that project at the time was that we also mapped financial incentives for non-extraction commitments. So if a country is deciding to keep those fossil fuels in the ground, okay, there's these 18 different mechanisms that other countries have used in the past that help countries that make such a decision and to invest in renewables, for example. So that was one way of using data to convince government officials. And another one is, of course, for example, the typical, when I was working for 350, I didn't work directly with that, but it was something that other colleagues did. So when we were about to release the documentary, the organization hired a very well-known data visualization illustrator. I cannot remember her name, but she's amazing. And to make people understand the amount of emissions that this Vaca Muerta mega project could potentially emit if it was fully developed. And she used, some elements of pollution to instead of the typical pie charts. And so it looked very impactful. Also the colors, the way it make it more real and more, I would say, nasty in a way. So it would create a reaction. Also, when I was doing the documentary, the Vaca Muerta documentary, it was a very low budget documentary. So we have very few resources to how to show what we're showing. But there was a particular number that was very, very impactful, but it was tricky for us to show it in an impactful way, which was, there was the whole mess that we were showing in this documentary was done by only 80% capacity of that project. Sorry, 8%. So what does that 8% mean? So I remember that we were trying to understand how to show it, and we found out that you can extract recordings of time lapses on Google Earth. So you can see how an area has been evolving in the last 25 years. So we used that to show how the Patagonia was filled with those tiny little squares where there's now a oil well to extract oil and gas there. So it was very interesting how, this is what 8% looks like, and was like the whole Patagonia filling up with those tiny little squares. And while we were showing that, there was a song by a local artist talking about, it was like a reflection about the impact of progress in our lives. And it was, for me, it was a very clear way of how to create a specific impact, in a way. And for me, that only number was so important that it needed time. So it was a minute and a half, and maybe it was it's a lot of time. No, you need to understand what's at stake. It takes time for you to understand what that number means to you. So for me, that was the way to do it. Sometimes we understand that, when a friend of you tells you something that it's impactful, if you keep talking about it and it happened that nothing happens, you didn't have time to process it. So I think it's not only about us showing specific data in a certain way, but also the time that we are dedicating for that and for you to absorb that information. I think we have to be mindful about that as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting, and you talked earlier about like repetition as well. How sometimes, like if we see certain designs over and over again, we might not then think about them. But if we see certain data or certain information over and over again, we might then, like the first few times we've seen it, we didn't absorb it, but we, it's there and we then need time to process what does that actually mean. Yeah. So the 8%, was that around, I think we talked about this off screen. What was that 8% doing again?
So Vaca Muerta is an oil reserve.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually, yes, the whole deposit of oil and gas reserves. So 8% was the amount of resources that were extracted at the moment. So
only 8% of the resources were causing this amount of damage or,
the damage that we're showing in this documentary. So all of this is 8%, but specifically in this section of the documentary, I'm going to show you how it looks like specifically. So we put like the names of the different oil towns, how they look and how they have been involved in the last 25 years. So, and you see how it, like a sky that's full of stars, but it's oil wells, So Talco, and then Añelo, and then Allen, and then, those oil towns are full of those tiny little squares, and that's our Patagonia. And then after that, I'm going to show you what that square looks like on a larger scale. So you see that it's a huge place that how that little square affects all of the fauna and flora in the region, because you need trucks to get them, you need them to build roads and that, so it's a massive, it's very traumatic for the living creatures in the region and for the people as well.
So for impact, obviously impact can be very different. It takes a lot of time depending on, what it is we're trying to impact, and can be, years, decades. But have you seen some of the tangible impacts from some of the work that you have done?
It's a good question. I know that it depends on how we can define what impact is. If I show a documentary to someone and that starts a conversation, I would say, yes, it created an impact. And that was what the film was all about. And did it change any law? Well, it didn't. But perhaps the goal with that documentary was to start the conversation for more people to be aware of what's going on. So yes, it can create impact, or it has changed. things or create impact. But I think that if I had the chance to do it again, I would do things differently for it to create more impact in terms of the solution of the problem rather than starting the conversation. But I guess that I in my case, that didn't happen with that specific project. But for example, after I did the documentary, I wrote to Josh Fox because I wanted to work with him because he was one of the directors that started this massive impact campaigns. When he released his film Gasland, he did like 500 projections or more, and parts of his film were used to ban fracking in many countries, in many in many audiences to ban it. So he had a very good example of what visual impact can actually do for a cause. I think in New York State it was also banned, and they showed his film. There is a very, very well-known image that was used in many of those situations, where there's a farmer that is opening the tap of the water, and he can burn the water, like there's too much gas on the pipes because there's an oil well nearby, and you can burn it, So that image was very, what I'm trying to say is that there are ways to use data visualization or, to create an image that can create impact, that can actually create lasting change. And there's a whole, in documentaries world, there's this impact campaigns that are more often used, and there are more funds available to do that. So I don't know in a more general data visualization world, but I can say that in the documentaries, it's something that to use those images to create impact is something that is encouraged more often, I would say.
Yeah. I was thinking about some of the projects you were talking about earlier, where you used visualization to talk to decision makers. For example, where your colleague was mapping the areas within the UNESCO areas, or like Do you think did that then help the decision makers make certain decisions about policies, whatever they were going to do? I mean, maybe the idea was just to start the conversation, but then the impact comes a lot later. But do you think that then affected how the decision makers were able to decide on what they did next?
I think that can happen. But I think that we also need to be smart on what we don't know. Like, for example, we don't know if what we're showing can actually be something that can be part of an ongoing conversation within that government, for example, which is something that happened. We showed them some data around the coal mine, and that coal mine was something that they were deciding not to extract, and they were saying not to extract there anymore. So did they know how to make that feasible? So the other project linked to the financial incentives was key there. So I think it's important to create data visualization based on current problems, things that, that governments or organizations or institutions are deciding at the moment. So it will have a greater impact if it's something that it's already on their plate, So sometimes we're working with things that are not necessarily a problem for governments, for example, at the moment. So it will be a longer road, to get to them, to get their attention and to make something impactful for them. But sometimes there's ongoing problems that they have, and so you have to find a way to link whatever you have to offer, whatever you care about, to that, and to make it, whatever you're showing to them, link to what they care about. So that I would think that the more links we have with what they care will make whatever we show more impactful.
Yeah.
And I think we need to do some intel with that first, try to understand again the audience. What do they care about? What can they do with that information?
And I think you said earlier, it's like depends how involved you are then ongoing into that. Like you might have only been invited to do one presentation, you did your presentation, but they were already making decisions about a certain thing. Did your one presentation impact their decision making? We don't know, but it may have played a role in how they decided, right? And so sometimes we just have to accept that we won't be in that. We can't actually measure the specific impact because we're not involved long term, but we can, I guess, over time, maybe you can ask them at a later stage, and sometimes that impact is so far down the track, you can't necessarily pinpoint it to one thing, like because it's a system of things that are happening. So it's interesting.
Yeah, but I don't necessarily agree with that. I think because that's something that it's also something very interesting in terms of what can impact campaigns offer to documentaries, for example. So impact can be many things. Impact can be, for example, to position leader within the community. That can be impact. Impact can be that get at least 10 conversations with government officials. Impact can be, it has to be measurable somehow. The thing is, I think sometimes we tend to think of impact in ways that don't create impact in a way. Like if you are only measuring like the social media followers, but they didn't do something with that, I wouldn't say that it's impact. But if those followers have signed a petition that a legislator or a parliamentarian, read in the Congress, I would say that, I think that we need to set goals that create actual impact. And we have to think, how is the data visualization that we're using supporting to that goal? How can we use that impact of data visualization in order for us to succeed in those specific goals? But we need to understand that first. And also, I think that it's also important to not to, I'm going to quote something that we learned because we were colleagues in this Homeboard Bound program. And in the program, we learned that strategy is not about making a plan, because the plan that we're making today, it's based on this context that they will change in 2 days' time. There's opportunities that you haven't seen yet that will be open in 2 months, and they are not even in, they are non-existent at this moment. So I think it's also important to understand that those objectives may change in a good way. They could be more ambitious if the context changes and we have more opportunities and we can create a greater impact. But it's also interesting to try to think also possible scenarios of things that could happen and what opportunities may arise and how we can use our data to create such opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I guess an ongoing, the strategy is not just a plan, but there's so many, change is inevitable, right? And I mean, I think you said earlier, even it's not if the audience will change, it's when and how they will change. They will change. And that I think goes then to opportunities and I mean, even data that's available potentially as well. Yeah.
Like, for example, it's not about data visualization, but it's interesting. For example, now there's a lot of pots of financing for many people that we know that are linked to Trump's decision at the moment. So you can say that this creates a chaotic situation where there's few resources. But the resources that there will be probably more focus in the most urgent themes. One of them could be migration in the US, for example. So I'm not saying that this will happen, but I would assume that there will be more resources more focused on that, because in this context, that subject is urgent. And I think, that even in chaos, it's a good thing, because then you can create strategies based on the fact that there could be more focus there. So perhaps there are, other linked causes that could benefit to that focus on migration. And I'll just give an example, but
yeah, no, it does make sense. And I think it goes to your point earlier around finding a way to link what you're doing to what your audience cares about. And if there's only certain resources, you need to do that, or limited resources, you need to do that in a very focused way. So you may be able to actually create more impact in this environment, but it will be targeted. Yeah. Yes. I'm just looking at the time. We've talked a lot about some examples, some impact, measuring impact, what is impact? And you've also shared some of the challenges as well, and how you particularly think about audiences and what will be useful or impactful for each of those. When we may be focusing on an international audience versus a local audience, but you treat them differently, even if they're in the same kind of documentary or something along those lines. So let's just finish now on a suggestion. So a suggestion for listeners to use data storytelling in their work or life. So any ideas of how, I guess, our listeners could focus more on how they could use data storytelling?
Okay, it's a good question. We talked about this off the record, but I think it's important for the listeners to understand that when you are telling a story through data, or telling a story in general that you care about, I think it's one of the most important elements is why you're telling this story. What of everything that you're telling was the thing that really touched you? And how can you create the same environment or that same reaction that you had? For example, when I was doing the documentary for Vaca Muerta, when I went there to shoot, it felt for me that it was like being in a horror film, because there were things happening that looked fishy. I felt uncomfortable. There were things that happening that shouldn't be happening. So the way that I chose to tell the story was bringing some elements of horror films to the documentary that I was doing. And in that way, I felt that I could create that same reaction that I had when I was there. The music, the choice of the music that I used was based on that as well. It was music that was, it reminded me of Stranger Things, the kind of things that are happening below the surface and above the surface. There's two things happening at the same time. And so I think it's the most important thing is to understand why we're doing this and how we can create those reactions that we had that made us care about this so much. And also what we talked before is to try to understand that this is an experience. So you have to give that experience certain time. How you can create that experience? How can you make people be more engaged with whatever you're doing? How you can give them the proper space to focus on it, to reflect on that? And I think that also to be mindful about not telling too much, but rather telling what's important. And it's not about how beautiful it looks, but rather how whatever you're showing can create a specific reaction that can lead for people to act or to do something specific.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'm glad we got to this question so you could share that again, because we did talk about that last week. And I think that's really great advice. And I also think, not everyone will, depending on what they do, I suppose, will use data storytelling. But now that they're aware, they might see how other things that they're interacting with are using data storytelling as well. And I also think it's important to, a lot of the time we talk about data as just, numbers and whatever, but we're bringing in their storytelling element, bringing that human element into it and the emotions and things like that, that we can't just ignore those. And that in the arts and creativity, we use emotion quite a lot. So how do we bring that experience then into our decision making and our, kind of big problems we're trying to solve as well? I think marrying those together is really important and key if we are going to create a better future together. Yeah. So thank you again, Rocio. I really appreciate your time and I look forward to talking to you again soon. See you later.
See you later. It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. You can find the show notes for this episode and all other episodes at zoeether.com/podcast. That's ZOEEATHER.com/podcast. Have you got a question for me or one of our guests? We'd love to hear from you. Just shoot us an email at hello@mysmart.community. If you enjoyed the show, make sure you follow the podcast wherever you listen and connect with us on LinkedIn too. And hey, ratings and reviews are always welcome. They help more smart humans just like you find the show. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.